Hello, everyone. Welcome to the June 2021 Integration Down Under. We've got a few of the people on already. Dan's here, Steef-Jan's here, and myself. Basically, going ahead and get started. If you have questions tonight, I do have some Azure passes to give out for the people that have questions. So if you have questions, basically type them into the YouTube questions, and they'll show up on the screen that we're monitoring for that. So let's go ahead and get started. So the organizers for Integration Down Under are Martin Abbott in Perth, Dan Toomey in Brisbane, Renee Bowers in Sydney, Wagner Severa in Auckland, and myself here in Melbourne. And we get out of lockdown phase 2 this evening, so I can make it to Costco tomorrow because it's 25.1 kilometers from my house, and I can go 25 today. So here's Steef-Jan's presentation. It's on the new Logic apps. I'm really interested to see his interpretation of that and some of the demos there. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Steef-Jan. And let me add his screen to the stream. And I will remove Dan and I. And
I'm all visible. It's all good.
Yep, looks good. And I will hand it over to you now.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone from Down Under. So that's Australia and New Zealand. This time it will be virtually from the Netherlands I'm presenting. I've been around in your areas actually just before COVID really started. So I was in Auckland in February last year, and including some visits to Sydney. Unfortunately, not that time to Brisbane and Melbourne. I've been there before as well. I haven't been to Perth yet, so it's a beautiful country, both actually, but they're also very big compared to the little small country that I live in. Okay, anyways, I've been asked to do a session, or at least a presentation to you guys. So I'm going to talk about, the new Logic app, Logic app standard. So before it was Logic app preview. So I'm going to dive into that. I work as a technical integration architect, so I've been in the integration space for quite a while. It used to be BizTalk a bit, but now it's the last 5-6 years predominantly only Azure, and working with the Azure integration services, which include Logic apps. So and HSO, that's the company I work for. It's an ISV that works a lot with Dynamics, but that also includes integrating with Dynamics or other systems. So that's what I do. Let's go to the next slide. So, like I said, I work for HSO. I'm an Azure MVP, so that's for the last 12 years. I'm also an editor for InfoQ. So if you're not familiar, it's infoq.com. So that's a news website that just covers a lot of technology, not just Azure tech, but also Google, AWS, other cloud platforms and vendors, but also a lot in observability, DevOps, programming language, and so forth, and architecture. So it's a pretty generic website all about tech news. I'm also an organizer of the Azure user group. Currently, we only did in person, so currently we're not doing anything because of the lockdown, but we're slowly getting out of it. So maybe after the summer, we'll also do some in-person session again for the Azure user group in the Netherlands. Also organizer what's called the Azure Lowlands. That's a one-day event. It's a small event with local speakers from the Netherlands and Belgium, because that's basically in the old days, that's referred to as the Lowlands. So I'm doing this together with elders, so we're kind of organizing this yearly based one-day event. And I also write a little bit for serverless nodes, so stuff about serverless technologies, functions, but also Logic apps and stuff, and provide some little tips. And the other thing I like to do is running, traveling. So as you can see here, that beer glass, that's a picture taken from Coogee Beach last year. So if you wonder what that beer glass is, but that's the beach in the background. Okay, without further ado, so I assembled a little agenda. So kind of, what I'm going to talk about. The new kid on the block, that's Logic App Standard. I dive into runtimes because I think that's interesting too, compared, having the new Logic App with a different runtime compared to what you have already. I'll dive a bit into the developer experience, some other aspects, the non-functional, so more from a holistic view of this technology. Call to action in the end, and we'll probably have some time for Q&A as well. So Logic App Standard. So this came out pretty recent during Build and also the last Integrate conference a week or two back. This was covered as well. So previously it was known like Logic App Preview, announced during Build last year, or at least there were some talks about this technology, or at least a new Logic App runtime, enabling you to build Logic apps just locally in your integrate IDE, basically, so integrated development environment. So instead of using Portal, you could use a tool like Visual Code. So this is pretty new. It was announced and now it's available. Before that, it wasn't known as Logic App Standard. It just had the acronym Preview. Okay, now it's live. So we have it now. So it's new tech, or it's a new capability of Logic Apps. And what I think it's important to know is just take a step back. So what did we have? So like 5 or 6 years ago, Logic App was launched, is a preview, then a GA, and then slowly got a lot of adoption and even progressed into the quadrant, into the upper right corner, right, together with Telboomi and some of the other competitors, because it's deemed as an integration platform as a service. And basically what the tech under is, the runtime basically consists of a couple of components. You got the resource provider, which basically looks into your workflow. That's what you drag and drop in the designer. And there's a code behind, which is domain-specific language. So you might be familiar with that. And that's being interpreted into task and dependencies. And this is transgressed over to the Logic App runtime that executes it. And the other aspect, so you got your runtime on one end, but you can also have you're working with connections, right? And there are over 300 to 400 connections. You can even do a custom connector and all that stuff. And that's the component responsible for that is that connection manager, right? That has to do with configuration, credentials, tokens, etc. And then you got your runtime, which basically abstracts that connector based on an open API description. So those are kind of the components that make up that Logic App service. So if you create a Logic App, and this is just an example where you just do a pclock on a queue, you pick up the message. The message is an array of all kinds of, let's say, rows or items that's being looped through. You do an insert, and then you complete that message. So this could be something you create in the designer. And once you save this, you've got a workflow definition. And that workflow definition sits somewhere in a region where you provision the Logic App. And this one is being triggered when a message enters the service queue. There's this interval you configure, let's say it's every 30 seconds. Message there, it will trigger a task because that's how you define it. Your definition, the domain-specific language defines that the trigger task is when a message enters the queue. Then there's a workflow orchestrator. So this sits somewhere in a data center in all these servers. There's this orchestrator that gets kind of, the complete definition and needs to divide that in all kinds of tasks. So you got your for each, you got, in parallel, all kinds of SQL inserts that's going to take place. All little kind of tasks that are going to be executed in parallel. Unless in the for each, you do in your settings and then you set the concurrency on 1 and then you can have it sequential. But by default, it will just do this in parallel. And once all these tasks are done, you get your complete message, or at least the workflow orchestrator will send, okay, I'm completing the message because I'm done. And then your workflow is complete. So this is the Logic App engine under the hood for the last couple of 5 years. The Logic App you're familiar with, which is also labeled as Logic App Consumption now. And those tasks that I talked about are, there's no active thread or management or whatever. It's just, it looks at that domain-specific language and it's an inverted graph. It's like, okay, I'll start with this because this is my trigger and it's followed by multiple actions. So this is usually what a workflow consists of, a trigger with one or multiple actions, which consists of a flow. So this domain-specific language thing that's being interpreted by the resource provider, chunk it up, and it will do all kinds of tasks. These tasks have to run at least once. So this orchestrator will distribute those tasks to, in that region, in a data center, to all kinds of machine. You have to execute this. And if it doesn't work, or it says, hey, I don't respond, then it will be distributed to another machine that will at least try to execute it once. And by default, for certain things that can happen in transition errors, throttling, or whatsoever, there's also this retry capability already baked in. And by default, it will try 4 times in kind of an exponential backup manner to do an invoke to, let's say, another service, if you do an HTTP connector or anything else. So there's also this retry capability built in as well. So there's already some resiliency built in this engine, which resides in a data center, which you don't see at all. That's your runtime, and it will, of course, auto scale a bit. So that's why that's called serverless. And that's basically because of the engine, not per se with the connectors. You could debate if it's serverless or not, but let's just keep it at that. But that's how it works. And then there's a second option. And what I mean by a second option is that, slowly after 2 or 3 years, Microsoft also offered what's called an isolated option. Similar to the Azure service environment, there was also an integration service environment, which basically means that that runtime that sits in a data center that you share with all kinds of other enterprises or businesses that leverage the same region, you're in line more like, no, I want my own set of runtime for my connectors and logic app, and then execute it. It's not consumption-based anymore. It's more isolated. So you pay a monthly fee for the consumption of your dedicated compute, which is 24/7, as long as once you provision it, you keep it running, is yours. So it has this flat fee structure. It has an integration account. You can do multiple transactions, I think in the millions. And if you need to scale up, then you can add additional units. So you can have more throughput and scale and everything in there. The other thing is that with an integration service environment, you also get some of the enterprise features and support for VNets and such and ExpressRoute. So that's your second option, and that's what he had. And now we have a third new option, which is the standard, which is also deemed or labeled as single tenant. So you have your multi-tenant, isolated, and you have your single tenant. And the third option, the standard, all depends on that workflow runtime, orchestration engine, as you see depicted here, but it all is with the underpinnings of the Azure App Function Runtime. So that's what you see depicted here too. And if you look into the documentation as well, one thing is it's still the same domain-specific language, but then there's some underpinnings and mechanisms that will interpret your DSL. And that will just create all kinds of jobs, and it will sequence those actions into what's called a directed acyclic graph of jobs. So it's kind of similar what happens in that other runtime, but now it happens within the app service. And then it gets compiled, and then it gets sequenced, and then it gets executed. And the scalability is just, the service can just set up multiple threads and stuff inside that runtime. So it's a bit different. And then you also have the notion of Azure storage, where the persistence being taken place in case you choose for a stateful workflow. And I get to that as well. So this is your new runtime. And the interesting thing is that you have to attach an app service plan to it, which means that you can influence your runtime, as in you can dimension it with compute, with CPU, with memory and such. So you have those plans, and I will dive into that too as well. So now you have 3 options. Okay, what's then the developer experience? Because that's different. It gears more towards what you might be familiar with Azure Functions. And if you develop the Azure Functions, you can create them locally. You can fire up that runtime, which is the same runtime that sits on the standard, and then you can start testing and debugging this all locally. And this differs much with what you might be used to with that consumption logic app, because that predominantly is taking place in the Azure portal. Currently, I'm also working a lot with that portal with the logic app consumption, because it's a better experience. It doesn't as good if you do this in Visual Studio. It just, with the windows and sizing, it just doesn't work. So I can run and test them also there in the portal, because I can't do it locally. There's no emulator or anything instrumented for me. There's no runtime I can have my workflow run in and then do debugging or execution of it. So I'm confined to that Azure portal. And once I need to deploy that over multiple environments, I kind of have to extract that logic app definition and the ARM template locally, including creating parameter files, which you see a screenshot here. You even can automate it with PowerShell, then push it to your repo, and then you can have pipelines, which could be classical or the YAML pipelines. So the difference is, the experience is really different. It's because you now can do it locally. You can create a project. You can debug locally, set breakpoints. You can use the connectors. There's some built-in connectors, giving you some better performance too, because it's all packaged in one. You get your source control from the get-go. The interesting thing, though, or the thing is, it's only available in Visual Studio. So I got the questions during Integrate was also, hey, it's a Visual Code. You get your extension for Logic App Standard. Why not Visual Studio? I, for instance, am a Visual Studio guy. Functions, a lot of other stuff. I usually use Visual Studio. So I'm accustomed to it for the last 20 years. And now, for the standard, I have to use code. So this is going to be different. You'll see this in the demo too. I'm not too familiar yet with code, but that's something you need to get familiarized with. Or you might already be familiarized with Visual Code, and it won't be that much of a problem. The interesting thing, and I'm saying this, is that you can now start locally with a code-first approach, and then it's easier to debug and look at it, and then you take advantage of some of the Azure connectors locally, or you connect to your Azure subscription, and then you can also leverage the connectors that are available in the cloud as well. The other thing is that you also have a new designer. So they created a new designer. I think this is the third iteration. Once Logic App became preview, they had one designer. It quickly moved into the designer you're familiar with nowadays with Logic App and consumption. But there's also a new designer available for you, which feels faster, it feels more intuitive. You might even see that this new runtime is also visible in some of the consumption Logic Apps. So yesterday I was looking at my Logic Apps consumption, which I was creating for a customer, and all of a sudden, in a minute, it changed to this new design. So I'm thinking on the background, they're now migrating a lot of those Logic App consumption to this new designer. So the designer will be similar between standard and the consumption ones, and even if you create Logic App for ICE, the only difference is that with standard, you can do this local stuff with the runtime, and you cannot do this with consumption. Okay, so let's just let's just have a look at the environment. So this is my Visual Code environment. So I've created a project. So you have to set up a couple of things. You have to install a runtime and such. So in the Microsoft documentation, you can find this as well. It is basically sits here in Logic App Standard. So I have the extension, and if I click on this, create any project, then I basically get the outline like this. Let me just click this away. So initially you don't have a workflow at all. It's just one workflow. I call it just USD to Euro. This is the designer look locally. There's some other files available. You got your local settings. So the connection to, for instance, the service bus, maybe your hosting. The connections is different. So you don't have your connections with managed as in with consumption, but they're now also visible here in a connection.json. So if you're familiar with Azure Functions in a Visual Studio or code environment, then you might see, hey, this looks pretty familiar or pretty similar. Now here, you can also click on Use the Connectors from Azure. Besides the built-in ones there's all kinds of other menu options. You can open a designer. So if you click on the designer, then this is your designer. So if I select this, for instance, that you get your parameters, settings, code view, and all that stuff on the right side of your screen, or at least of your IDE. And if I go to the portal, it will be similar. It's just one that I've built in here, and you get the same type of experience. So the experience in the portal and in the Visual Code is the same. Okay. The other thing I like to mention is that with standard, you don't have to, or you're not depending on the integration count anymore. There's an artifact where you can place your schemas and your maps. So in this particular one, I also created a liquid template, which means that in your designer, at least here, you can, for instance, place the transform JSON to JSON, and then the content, but in here, let's say I had multiple maps, then these would be visible here. Okay, let me just start running this. Fingers crossed, because usually I'm not sure if this will work on my environment or not, but I will start it. There's much you can demo. You can demo with debugging. You can containerize it, which I talk about it as well. There's tons of stuff you could potentially demo while looking at this. But I can tell you there's a lot of material already present now in the documentation allowing you to do a walkthrough. So it will tell you how to set up your environment, what to install, etc. Now, I could click on this and then say, okay, let's go. But that won't work because it kind of still requires this. And this might be familiar if you have an HTTP triggered logic app, then you also have to put in the signature and such. So this is still the same. So I will copy this. In my Postman, and then I will send it. And let's see if this works. Yes, it worked. So this was executed. You can see some here. You can even expect a run. This is a stateless workflow. So let's have a look at the run itself. Yes. This is always interesting. Let me just refresh it. Let me have another look at the run. Since this is stateful, all the information is stored in tables and Azure storage tables and such. And now you can see the execution times. So a lot of the information, again, usually you would click this and see this another way, but this is how the experience is now. This is my response. It's a little bit bigger. And I'm only interested in the USD to Euro and Great Britain, the pounds, and then I'm giving a response back. And you can also see the execution times here, the steps, how long it took place and such. So this is your local experience in the environment. Then I have something similar in the cloud. Sorry, that's the wrong one. So let's have a look at how this will look in the cloud. You got your Logic App overview, got some other things. The interesting thing here, this is your workflow and connections. Here you see your schemas and maps. You see the deployment center capability. And this is interesting too, because it allows you to push your Logic App to a repo, and then you can connect the repo into a certain branch, and then you only have to do sync, and then presto, your workflow would be here. So that works as well. And I'll get into deployment as well because there are multiple options. And this is your workflow, this is your code, and the code is just the same as the code behind in the previous one. So it's still that domain-specific language. You got your designer here. And that's similar, like I already said, in Visual Studio. And this is completely different if I just take something similar with that old Logic App, or at least consumption-based, and this still is the old portal, or at least the old designer. It's possible that you could see also the new designer. And this is a bit different. Also, if you look into the runs and stuff, compared to the new standard Logic App. So here you can still see, but it won't do the O point. So you don't, it's just 0 seconds or 1. It's not as accurate as it is with the standard. Okay. Let's move back to the slides. So what I just showed you is this, right? So I just fired up a runtime, and there's an emulator behind it that needs to be running. So this is the storage emulator. I think there's also something that's called Azure. There's a different type of emulator available. But this is something you set up locally. Then I'll do I just trigger it through Postman by sending a message to it. It will then get the open exchange rate you saw. Then it will do a mapping, and then it will turn that response. So that's what you just saw from a more functional side of things. Okay, and then you have something with connections. So the connections are set within the Logic App when you choose to connect with something, and you can create those in Visual Code, but now they're stored in connections as JSON. So they're not managed connections which you have in Logic App consumption, but it's now different. The built-in connectors, there's a set of built-in connections you can see versus the ones you get from Azure, and they only need a connection string. And I also showed you pretty briefly the service bus connector built-in that only requires the connection string. So you have something like connections now. which used to be managed connections in the consumption-based, but now it's more fine-grained where you get a little bit more control of it. And this is also something that you separately need to deploy as well. And then the other interesting thing is the parameterization. So with the consumption, you had to create the parameters in the workflow and then set them in the ARM templates, run the extraction tool. With Logic App Standard, you can still create those parameters, but now they're in this parameter.json. And you can even have some references with the app settings and key vault references. The flip side, though, is if you want to have parameters for multiple environments, you still need to create different parameters.json, which is similar to the parameterization for Logic App consumption, where you have multiple parameter files for different environments as well. And then we get to the deployment. So deployment Logic App is with this extract template. Then you create parameters for each environment, and then you only have one workflow per Logic App. Then you push this to a repo, and then you execute your pipelines. With the Logic App Standard, your deployment is a bit more like the function apps. So you can package those. There's a package.json. You can convert it to a NuGet batch-based product if necessary. Connections are deployed separately. The other interesting thing is similar to a function app, you have multiple workflows in this case. Well, function app, you have multiple functions. And the other thing is that, it also includes the schemas and mappings, which previously, with consumption was in an integration account. So you get a little bit more package centralized way of deploying one or multiple workflows to multiple environments if necessary. So that's one thing. So you get your deployment, you get your experiment, you get your connections and such. So it's all a little bit more, I would say, fragmented. And then the other thing is you can also containerize. So you can either choose to create a workflow which is stateful or stateless, but you can also say, and now I want to containerize this, which means that it has Docker support. Basically, you containerize this. It's also listed in one of the walkthroughs, also in the Microsoft documentation. But it just creates this container, which then subsequently can host on AKS. And it's the Azure function, the Azure Kubernetes capability. But you can also push it to other clouds. You can even push it more on-prem, where you can have a cluster running, or even on the edge. This just means that there's multiple hosting capabilities for your standard Logic App versus the ICE, which is the dedicated environment. It's just dedicated runtime, or if you have your shared runtime, which is your multi-tenant Logic App. So holistically, and this is a picture I got from Tom Kirkhope, who wrote an interesting blog post about Logic App Anywhere, and I think there's multiple blog posts talking about hosting your standard Logic App in other places. But it just gives you a sense of where your deployment is, but it's just that containerization that makes it interesting. It just is that Logic App Standard is not just bound to the cloud per se. While your your multi-tenant and your ICE is, your standard is not. Okay, let's move to non-functional. So let's look at some other aspects of Logic App Standard. So there's hosting options with your consumption, standard, and ICE. And consumption is just serverless options. So you just pay for your actions, and those are just the connector actions and your actions that follow up. And you pay those. You see that in the pricing. This is just your serverless option, because service is defined by that you only pay for what you use. Then you have your standard option, which has an app service plan or what's called a work service plan. And you got WS1, 2, and 3. And then, of course, you get your integrated service environment, which is an isolated environment, just has a flat fee. You find it in pricing as well. Then you have more or less a monthly cost if you're running it monthly, or it's an hourly base, I believe, and it's different. And each depend on what kind of workloads you want to land on your workflow capability in the cloud, or your integration platform as a service capability. So I'm saying that the workflow and some of the non-functionals are drivers for what kind of hosting option you will choose. Okay, what's the plan for standard? Well, currently you have this WS1, 2, and 3, and the pricing starts with $175 core a month. So this is the US dollars, but there will be in different currencies. And the thing is, though, there's no dev test or a way to go to isolate it. It's just this is what you're getting currently, and it might change over in the future. So this is all about hosting and billing. And then what about performance? Because that's interesting too, because the serverless option is more like it will auto scale, at least that runtime will. With ICE, it's just a dedicated set you're having, so you have a certain performance. And then, of course, with standard, the performance is a bit more depending on how you dimension your runtime under it. So if you do the WS 1, 2, or 3. And then the other interesting thing too is because it's a logic app, it's kind of a container similar to a function app that you can load in one or multiple logic apps. And then also the connectors, the built-in connectors can also be in that runtime as well. So you all share the same process, which of course can up the performance as well. And then the thing I'm saying, what you have to really consider is the number of workflow connections belonging maybe to a functional area domain, but also workloads again. Because if I have 5 workflows, but there's one really demanding a lot of resources, it could impact the performance of your other workflows. So you've got to think about this too. This is a similar thing. You have to look also at your app servers, or at least your function app, if you host multiple functions in there too. What's their demand for resources? So the same thing accounts for, I think, when you're looking at performance and having multiple workflows, in this case in your logic app, how that will work and function, and also performance-wise. So I think performance testing is an important thing too when you have multiple of your workflows in one logic app, basically depending on this runtime. Then the other interesting thing, and this also considered it with, I think, performance as well, because there's 2 options for logic app standard. You can either run it stateful or stateless, and the latter means that it doesn't persist any state or anything. So it means less cost, no logging or anything, and just, bam, bam, throughput. You could have something similar in logic app consumption, where it's only state only, where you could say, okay, I'm going to push it to high throughput, which what it says, it can process a large number of concurrent runs. So you can optimize a little, but not as much, I think, as with standard. Think about this though, with the logic app standard, that state is a design decision. And the other thing is that you have to note is that not everything that's available in stateful is available in stateless. So that's something you have to think about too. Okay, let's look at another aspect, which is security. And this differs per, I would say, option. So the consumption versus standard versus ICE. So consumption, you can have access restriction through API management, IP filtering, there's OAuth support, and managed identities. So all those capabilities are available on logic app consumption. Now with ICE, you have also a dedicated support for VNets and such. So you have some capabilities there as well. And you have standard, which inherits some of the capabilities of the app service runtime. However, there's no OAuth support yet. Something you find in logic app consumption, but it's not there yet in standard. What I'm trying to say is that the security is not completely in pair or in feature parity of all the security capabilities, not completely standardized yet of all these options. So it just differs. Similarly, that also accounts for networking. So with consumption, you're limited to outbound with on-premise data gateway if you're looking at outbound connectivity. Standard, however, offers outbound connectivity through the hybrid connections of VNet, and also embed connectivity with private endpoints. There's just more support for networking, which just stems from the fact because it inherits a lot of that app service runtime. And like I said, with the integration service environment, you get your kind of your VNet integration. So there's some networking capability as well, where you can also leverage things like a load balancer and something like those, and you get subnets and all that kind of stuff. That's from the networking aspect. And then finally, you get also something like monitoring. So the monitoring, you might be familiar with consumption. You can set up this log analytic workspace, and then you get this dashboard capability with OMS. It's still though in preview, which I find still funny but it's pretty useful. It allows you to drive in and such. So this is the monitoring capability. There's no ties into, let's say, application insights and such, which you do have with logic app standard, because again, it inherits a lot of that app service runtime. So you have your application insight, you have logstream, you have process explorer, kudu. A lot of the capabilities you might be familiar with functions is also available now for your logic app standard. And I also, and maybe some of you too, had always this feeling like, one way or another, logic app will converge a little more with the function, because function apps in the runtime and having it, using it just one kind of capability through Azure Monitor with the application insights and such. And it gets a little bit more centralized in a way that if you're using Azure integration services, the logic apps, the app services, so you can leverage more of the similar capabilities also with regards to monitoring, which I think is a big plus as well. Okay, but now all things considered, and it's kind of what I round up. In the end of the day, regardless of those options you have, you're looking at design at first. So you have your customer, if you're working for a customer or client or internally, how I'm going to set up my workflow in general. Am I completely leave it up to the citizen developer, so the Power Platform? Or if it's more integration related, then of course you're getting into the logic app. And then you have to look at, okay, what kind of patterns do I support? What are my requirements, workloads, etc. So that's your first step. So still, that's your starting point. And then you have to look at how am I going to develop this? Because the experience for the different type of logic apps and Azure integration services in general might differ a bit. Might that you need more or less tooling. You might need Visual Studio Code and maybe some other tooling as well. With regards to, let's say, mapping, if it's consumption, the integration account, how I'm going to set up the mappings. There's tooling on-premise again, BizTalk environment. If you have it, then you can leverage the mapping tools there. If it's for standard, I haven't really found a useful mapping tool yet, so it still feels something that's missing. And then also you got to think about, okay, what's the way I'm going to work? How I'm going to set up my solution, how I'm going to work in a Scrum manner and such, how I'm going to tie in my deployment, because there's quite some options if you look at deployment. Deploying can be through the repo, pipelines deploy, it can be through the deployment center. You can even use Bicep. So I saw Toon van Hout already tweeting saying, hey, I'm using Bicep to deploy my infrastructure as code, the logic app with all its dependencies, app insights, the storage account and such. So there's different ways of deploying. You can even do the right-click deploy if you want with your logic app standard. So there's just too many ways. Even something that I reached out to the product group saying, all these kind of options. What's the way to go? Because even during integrate for standard, they even just showcase deployment with GitHub Actions. So there's too many actions too. So you have to think about your deployment strategy as well with regards to your logic app. If it's standard, if it's ICE, if it's the consumption, combined with all the other services that build up your integration solution in general. And then finally, you also have to think about the operate, because that differs too. The tooling that a support engineer might need versus all the capabilities it has in Azure. With consumption, it's maybe more log analytics. When you're doing standard logic app with functions and such, you can maybe holistic or maybe centralize your logging using application insight and such. So also there's choices to be made and things to consider when going forward. So that's why I'm saying all things consider. It's design, develop, deploy, and operate. All those aspects and stuff that I talked about is something you have to consider and think about, and really think thoroughly before you start onboarding, let's say, on Logic App Standard in this case. Okay, the call to action. So if you're like, okay, I'm interested, I want to learn more about technology, I just scratched the surface a bit, the developer experience is a bit more richer. There's stuff with deployment that you can find out because there's so many options, but the documentation really is up to date now. Once the Logic App Standard came into general availability, the documentation was instantly updated. Instead of preview or single tenant. You find some walkthroughs there too. The other thing is that also Logic App is also Arc enabled, which means that you containerize and manage it as well, but it's still in preview. But if you want to look at that as well, that's something in the future. There's an on-demand video, which is an interesting one, by one of the product group members. Derek Lee also did a presentation at Integrate, which will be available soon in a couple of weeks as well. But it's a good video as well. It's from Build. So you can look at that one. You can look at the GitHub repo, for examples, for the DevOps single tenant. Can be Azure DevOps, can be GitHub. You can look at. The other interesting thing, I think, is some of the documentation around pricing models, which also dives into hosting. And last but not least, there's also Microsoft Learn, which has an introduction into logic apps in general, but I also think for standard. So those are kind of the resources, and I will share this slide deck with you as well, which can help you in your further journey if you want to explore this technology. And
so we have
a few questions and answers. Yes,
we do have a few questions.
Good.
So the first question is, can I run standard under a consumption app service plan?
Can I run standard? No, not yet. I think there was a question also raised by people, I think, at Integrate and maybe otherwise as well. Like I showed you, it's currently only available in the production.
Yeah. So from what I was told when I asked the question recently was that the WS ones are tailored specifically for the Logic apps, which is not like the same one that the functions are using. So that's one of the reasons.
No, but the interesting thing though is that I think Toon van Houten again also experimented, I think, with ARM templates as such, and then was able to choose dev tests. So that was kind of funny. So apparently,
as a follow-up question, he said, I asked that question about consumption as you can do it, but you shouldn't. And actually, when I tried to configure one last week, it did not give you a choice. And I had some preview Logic app standards pointed to a free app service plan, and they have stopped running. They will not run.
Yeah, I think at one point it was possible, but now it is not, maybe.
And then the next question is wondering about migration steps from consumption to standard.
Yeah, that's a very good question too. Yeah, you have to think about that approach too. So currently there's also people that worked on a BizTalk migrator tool. So you basically migrate your BizTalk kind of capability or orchestrations, whatever you have, to Azure. We're using Azure Integration Services consumption, but also with this new standard, you get another option. Not sure if that's baked in the tool yet. And then of course you can also look at your consumption and then how you're going to migrate those. I haven't tried it yet, but for instance, the domain-specific language that's basically defines your Logic app in a consumption way could maybe also be ported to a standard. So you can just overwrite that in your. Let me see. I'm still sharing my screen, right? So
yep.
There's the workflow definition. And presumably you could paste your DSL completely here and then right click and say open designer and then see if it renders and works.
Yeah, so there'll be.
We could test out if we want to. We can always do this. Let's just see.
There might be some situations where there's a couple of things that aren't in the standard
exactly.
yet.
That could be the problem.
Yep.
Well, while we're at it, why not try it? Yeah, why not? So, okay, and then I'm going to open the designer. So I just took the other one. Let me just click everything away. Cancel. No, this is the one I just overrode it. So opening the designer. Let's see. No, it's still thinking about the old one.
You will have to save the file before the designer can open it.
Sure, no problem. It's just a. Oh, well, here you go. See?
But yeah, so I thought because the DSL is the same.
Yeah.
You get that connector not found because you haven't got the connections and stuff there.
Yeah.
But that should work. There's going to be some stuff coming. I know I was talking to Beck a while ago about some of this stuff too. Another question is, can you write Logic apps in Bicep?
I know you cannot write Logic apps in Bicep, but you can leverage Bicep to deploy your Logic apps to multiple environments. I saw only a screenshot from Toon that you were able to do so. So that's the infrastructure as code part. So that's your Logic app environment, similar to the function app, combined with App Insights and your storage account.
I did run into one issue. The managed identity is not supported in Bicep.
Yeah, so that's true because Bicep, on the other hand, is still experimental and such, or at least experimental. It's still in previous, it's still worked on. I think they're now at a 0.4 version. So I'm not sure that everything yet is supported as the way you're familiar with ARM templates. So, But
Yep.
yeah, the answer to the question is, now you cannot write the logic app itself in a bicep language. No, it's just intended for deployment.
Yeah. So I haven't tried, and there was one question out here kind of implying, can I build the logic app and then decide whether I want to deploy to consumption or to standard? And I don't think so, because with the consumption based, you'd need the full ARM template, where in this designer, you've really only got the components of the logic app. You don't have the rest of that ARM in that workflow.json.
That's correct. Yes.
Let's see. Just going through the rest of the questions here. Okay. Dorn on the call is building an open source tool to migrate from the ARM consumption logic apps to the VS Code project. So that should be good. If you can pop that link to me, I can push that out in our integration down under Twitter account. Let's see. Can we access logic app run data via table storage easily?
Yes.
Okay. So that's the other question.
No worries, because let me see, logic app experiments. So what you need to do when you provision the, in this case, this one, right, the standard, you have to say, okay, you're hosting, of course, which is obvious. You have to set up also the storage.
So this is one thing Bex warned me about too. If you have very active logic apps, they're going to do lots of writes to storage. So your bill for storage accounts could be really high.
So here you see a lot, because I'm using, you're right, Bill, there's a lot of stateless of stateful workflows that I created, and you can access those. But then, of course, you know, there's lots that's being logged. It's accessible similarly to what you might be familiar with durable functions, because they also create this type of this thing like queues and tables, and where you can look into the flows itself and such. So this is kind of similar, and the accessibility is, you can wait, or at least search through all of this and look behind the things that you need to to look at. Interesting to note is that when you host things up in a container, then you have to dive into the secrets here as well to find out the specific, and I'll download it just for, let me just, come on, you can do it. Click here to download. There it is. Show in folder. And you'll see this in the walkthroughs as well, because you have to kind of do this. And then you have to look into the secrets. So in this case, you have to find this type of secret. So that's when you do containerization. So once you set your container, it's up and running locally with Docker, then you need to go to your storage account to find that secret, because you need the secret to get eventually that URL, including the signature, and then you can call it. So it's pretty interesting kind of set of steps you have to undertake to get, to access your HTTP trigger logic app inside a container.
Wasn't it the last Logic Apps Live that they talked about using SQL instead of storage?
Yeah, I don't know, because I haven't seen that one, Logic App Live. So.
Yeah, because they are looking for an alternative to the Azure storage. Because if you think about it, if you're putting it in container and you're hosting it on premises, you're not going to have access to Azure storage.
Nope, that's true.
So they're looking at being able to supply your own SQL. I think it's in the last Logic Apps Live. If you go out on YouTube and look at that, there's a preview program for that. And I think that will help people. That'll give you a way that if you're doing very high throughput and you don't want that storage cost of each one of those writes and things like that, you can spin up a SQL instance, and Azure SQL is one of the things you can use. And that way you've got a a known quantity of the cost for your tracking data and things like that.
True, yeah.
For any of you guys that put questions into the questions there, if you want an Azure pass, just ping me at bill@biztalkbill.com, and I will I can send you through a Azure pass. That one of the Microsoft guys out of Sydney, Simon Waite, gave me some passes to give away at the meeting tonight. So if you do want one, just reach out to me and do that. Anything else you'd like to add, Dan?
I don't need an Azure pass, but I do have a question.
That's
So you mentioned that the schemas and maps, you now don't need an integration account to use with the standard logic apps. Does that include BizTalk maps? Will the BizTalk maps just work?
I haven't tried it out
Yes.
because I just wanted to do liquid because I thought, that's funny to demonstrate. But I think that you can also do, at least there's also actions with schema, XML transformation. So my guess is that BizTalk maps, or at least the XSLT, will work as well. But I haven't tried it out yet.
Yeah, from what I understand, Dan, yes, you can upload the maps so that you don't need an integration account.
So you don't have to convert to XSLT, you just up the BizTalk maps the way they are?
No, you still have to do the XSLT.
Yeah, if I see, because you're getting
it's exactly the same as the consumption based.
So you by default, if you do this right, if you say, okay, let's start a project, then this will be your outline, and it also has the artifacts and the maps and the schema folders, but there's nothing in there. But if you start uploading, or at least putting those maps in this folder and your schemas as well, then they're accessible through the, let me just do that here, action. And I think if I do the JSON to JSON in this case, right, here we go, JSON to JSON, then see, you can just exit. In this case, there's only one, but if there's multiple, you can select those, and I think you can do something with this, but it's all baked in and built in. And once you locally test and debug it and it all works, then you can package this up and then shoot it to your repo and then deploy it subsequently. And there's there's no.
What I'm asking is if you can upload the BTM file, or if you have to.
No, you can't.
That's what I was wondering.
You have to do the validate map and go grab the XSL file.
Mm-hmm.
And also just for everybody's the user that's Dorn on the questions is actually Dan Probert, who wrote the BizTalk migrator. So he's working on that tool to go from the consumption-based ARM template to the Visual Studio Code project. Mm-hmm. So he threw me there. I didn't recognize the thing. He just sent me an email. So the other interesting thing I found that maybe people are interested in, I was doing some stuff with AS2 the other day, and I wanted to use the standard. Mm-hmm. And what it does, it still has to connect to a full-blown integration account.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You
can't use the artifact for the AS2 and the Edifact and the X12.
Yeah.
It's only for your maps and your schemas. And from what I understand, also, you should be able to do assembly references type thing in here, because you would, but I'm not sure exactly how they're meant to be done. I know that was early on. I haven't heard anybody mention that, whether you can do assembly references in there for, like, if you had code you wanted to call. So, but yeah, that was interesting. And the one thing that's missing at the moment, mm-hmm. that's causing me a little bit of grief, is the fact that the flat file encoder and the flat file decoder are not accessible either. You can't, they're not built in, and they're not available through Azure. So they're kind of in a nomad's land there at the moment. The flat file encoder is not that bad because you can almost get away with the liquid template, because the liquid template will do JSON to text. Yeah, the flat file one is causing me a little bit of grief on a couple of projects. But the interesting thing is that using standard and then connecting out to your integration account puts a connector in your connections there. And this has been one of the questions I've gotten from another local guy here in Melbourne is, how do I munge the connections in my DevOps pipeline? Because they're going to be different probably for each environment. So there is a thing we discovered a few months ago. There is a file transform that's in preview that will actually unzip the package that's created out of the compiler, and then allow you to have variables in like Azure DevOps, and it will replace those variables in any JSON file. You can specify your connections.json, and it will actually update those values. So it's one of the things you can do. And what it does then is it rezips the file. So when you deploy it, the contents is correct for that environment. So hopefully, I know Beck is working on some more deployment stuff for the Logic App standard. So hopefully, I'm trying to get her on for July to give us a talk in July around that.
Okay, cool.
So hopefully that's going to be good. So that was really good. I enjoyed that. What was it? Flat file actions need some of the BizTalk assemblies. Having to have them in the extension bundle available in VS Code, which causes licensing issues at the moment. So that's the explanation that we've got from that. So this is like my question too. I had a question with the BizTalk migrator folks about business rules. And I asked them, why don't they open source that code so that we can use it in Azure like we want to? And they said the comment I got was the code's not good enough to open source, which I'm not sure what that means, but I think there could be. That's an interesting answer to that flat file question. It would be nice though if they just had it available, made it an Azure one that you ran. That would be good. And hopefully in the next month or so, like everybody said, is that they'll fix this consumption issue on the app service plans. Because one of the things I like about the functions is I can get away with functions. I can put a free app service plan out there.
True. Yes.
Or even the consumption-based one, which I only pay when I run. Where right now with this thing costing, I think in Australia, it's about $250 a month. It blows my MSDN spend right away, pretty much. I was talking to some of the other guys like Michael Stevenson this afternoon on some stuff. And it was looking at, well, you go out there, you build your ARM templates or your bicep so that you deploy the standard in the morning, you deploy your code out of the repository, you do all your development work during the day, and then you delete it all at night. Because if you've got the process automated where it's creating it, then creation and deployment should be just automatic. And that way, if I happen to work on it 2 days out of a week, then I'm only paying for 2 days worth of having it running. So I'd have another consumption-based logic app out there at 6 o'clock at night or whatever that went out and deleted it all. So interesting ideas.
Yeah, it feels like the auto shutdown and stuff with VMs and all that thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, because that's what we were doing with VMs before the auto shutdown.
Exactly. That's what I mean.
We had things in the run book that would shut them down. and then they put the auto shutdown in. So, okay, Daniel says we need to pressure the product group to come up with a better solution. So,
yeah, I think there's still work in progress for a lot of things to get it a bit more. I would say that you really get productive. That there's, strict guidelines how you can do stuff with deployment and things you mentioned with the mapping and some of the other, I would say, child diseases, freely translated. So to really get this to a stable product and a very useful.
Yeah. For me, the biggest thing is the fact that the standards will run in an app service plan that we can use private endpoints to get into the VNet, or we can use the VNet connector. So that's going to solve the problem for a lot of customers that just didn't want to pay the price to run an ISE, but needed those to be able to access things inside of the VNet. And that, to me, that's the sweet spot of this going to be. I don't see that many of the people I've been talking to wanting to run it in containers, but it's more of being able to get into the VNets and get into the data there. So thank you again very much, Steef-Jan. It was good to catch up with you, and it wasn't too bad a time zone thing for you. So
no, it was excellent actually. So no worries.
So thanks everyone for attending. It was good.
Thank you.
The questions we got, that was really good, because this is like only the second time we've used StreamYard to do this presentation. And it was good to see that we're getting the questions coming through from the live on the YouTube. And the nice thing about it is now that as soon as we finish, the talk will be up on YouTube Live. And I'll add it to our playlist, so it'll show up on the Integration Down Under website for people to do. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending tonight.
Thank you.
Like I said, if you want a Azure Pass, just ping me at bill@biztalkbill.com. And I can send you out one. So thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Later.
Bye.